So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay on a map that I'm actually not familiar with at all, to be honest with you, although it must have been one that was added in 0.97. You can see that we have a largely flat field with a few outlying buildings here making up a sort of scattered village, as it were, and it does look as well as though there have also been some hastily dug trenches filled with water to litter across the battlefield as well. So based on the fact that we're sort of right in the middle of when my deadlines are, I have had to sort of make it so that I'm going to do one of these smaller battles that I've been given more recently as well. So we're going to be having a look at a 1v1, but at the very least this is a 1v1 on a map that does have a little bit more to it than something like the grassy plain, thankfully. So it'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of terrain features, there's some impassable areas in the trenches as well, so it's not just going to be a case of trying to swarm across the field. There are defensive positions that can be taken up, and it is going to be between two, to my mind, two pretty good factions, although for different reasons. We have Numenor, played by Hunter Wayward, who sent me the battle replay, and we have Rune across the way over there, played by Big Gun 09. So let's go through Numenor first of all. After all, it was Hunter Wayward that did send me the battle replay. This was the first 1v1 that I came across in my replay backlog, which is why it's going to be played now. So he's got some Belagire archers, which I think in the matchup against Rune is kind of a necessity, because Rune have got a lot of archers in terms of their numbers. Rune are quite comfortable when it comes to skirmishing with other factions' archers. There are a few factions that are better than them, of course, like Umbar and Dale, but for the most part Rune can sort of absorb that with their numbers. They do have a few decent archers at long range themselves in the form of stuff like the Variac mercenaries. The Narim as well with their flaming arrow effect are also nice, but the Belagire archers are a very good answer to that because they have decent armor when you upgrade them like this, and also they have those little bucklers which make them just that little bit more resilient against enemy skirmishers as well. So it's a good choice, I think, because if you are going to try and engage Rune at long range over a long period of time, you do need to have archers like this. I think Numenor's higher end archers in particular are a little bit better with their armor piercing, and their rangers are also a little bit more resilient than Rune's offering. But of course Rune have got a more varied skirmish line with their crossbows and their javelins, which we may see soon as we go into the runic line. I'm pleased to see that Hunter Wayward has brought a lot of the Seafarers of Nindamos. To my mind, they are the most versatile of Numenor's units because, of course, they have those javelins which are really high damage. You know, they can actually, they're on par actually with really high tier javelins in terms of their damage, with a missile damage of 10. They do get let down a little bit by the amount of ammunition they have, which is, you know, for balance reasons. Obviously you can't have a unit that's as cheap as the Seafarers of Nindamos have the same sort of damage as something that you would expect from something like the Balchor Sapphire Bladesman, for example. But the Seafarers of Nindamos don't have a lot of ammunition, so their initial job is to sort of really whittle down the enemy front line as they move forward. It's better if you can try and target down some of the enemy's higher tier units, but it's not the end of the world if you can, because then they make decent makeshift line infantry as well. So a very good multi-purpose unit that Numenor have at their disposal here, and very good against Rune as well, because while the Seafarers will lose in a melee fight against some of Rune's central units like the Loke Flag Rim, the Scion Rim, you know, the Gamp Rim, their sort of main line, they will be able to defeat the lower tier units of Rune fairly comfortably, which means that Rune maybe won't be able to rely on just having a pure numbers approach. They're going to have to try and dip into their quality, which is risky when you're going up against Numenor, because in terms of a quality fight, Numenor will handily win that against Rune, which is the main thing they have going for them, of course, in their roster. More Belagire archers, and when it comes to quality, this is what I'm talking about. The Romena units, Numenor have a real strong point here when it comes to their infantry. Really only the elves and the dwarves can really claim to have an outright stronger infantry force, I think, than Numenor, because, you know, in terms of quality, Numenor really do have a lot going for them. However, you do pay for that quality, which often means that Numenor do have smaller armies, of course. 2 units of Romena Nardukadar, which are the armor-piercing spears, good all-round unit. They can be used to try and zone out some of the deadly runic cavalry, like their heavy cataphracts. Of course, the armor-piercing and the anti-cavalry bonus will be especially useful against them. Perhaps even the Carmel's Dragon Knights if they get caught on them, but if not, they can still be very effective in melee because of that armor-piercing, and their stats are pretty good, honestly, because of how much they cost, but of course expensive, so they do need to be careful in the presence of runic crossbows and javelins, which are quite cheap. Romena Abarim as well, this is an area where Rune will struggle with as well, because while the Flagrim are a very good light infantry unit, they do have a sort of tilt towards their AP focus, which does mean in terms of stats, base attack and melee defense, they are going to be found wanting against the mighty Romena Abarim. But again, slightly lower in terms of numbers, so we'll see if that has a big part to play. The expensive units for Numenor are back here. We've already seen them just at the start. The Pharazim nobles, a sort of cross between melee knights and spear cavalry. It's, in many ways you can look at them in comparison to the other sword-wielding heavy knight cavalry. They are a little bit worse in melee against other cavalry units, but they're still very dominant, of course. But they do have a better charge as well, so maybe a little bit more versatile. But against Rune, it's not really going to matter, because Rune don't really have a melee knight in the same way that they do. Rune, if they're going to defeat the Pharazôn nobles, will need to do so through sheer numbers. Back here we have the Royal Legion of Armenelos and the Pharazôn Swordmasters, both high-tier units of Numenorian infantry. Again, this is an area where Numenor are going to be stronger than Rune. The Royal Legion can easily defeat the Carmel's Chosen. Well, I say easily, they will fairly comfortably defeat the Carmel's Chosen. They will at least get a fight out of it, but the Royal Legion are the superior unit. And Rune don't really have an equivalent to the Pharazôn Swordmasters, obviously one of the deadliest unit of heavy swordsmen in the game, alongside the likes of the Temple Executioners and the Noldorin Blade Masters, and the Haven Guard, of course, of Dol Amroth. Only they have a bit of a shield value as well, so that's something else, another feather that the Numenorians have in their cap there. Two units of the Romana Bawabrim, again, much like the Seafarers of Nindamos, their ammunition is the main thing that lets them down. In terms of damage, they're very strong. They're pretty decent in terms of their armour and shields as well. But of course, the main attraction is the fact that they have armour-piercing arrows, which is why their ammunition count is so low. But it will be interesting because the Bawabrim, really, they live and die based on how well you can choose your targets. If the Bawabrim go after the right targets, something like Carmel's Chosen or Dragon Knights, for example, a very, very good unit to bring. If you end up just wasting their ammunition on something like Easteron Hunters in this situation, a bit of a waste, considering how much they cost. Out here on the flank, we've also got some Belagai footmen. The closest thing Numenor have really to sort of a more disposable frontline unit. Obviously, basic spears like this, not the best in terms of damage, but they can at least form up a solid enough front line. And in this sort of situation, when you're up against a faction which can potentially bring quite a lot in terms of numbers, it does behoove you to sometimes bring a little bit more when it comes to your own numbers, if you are able. Moving on, however, to Big Gun 09's Runic army. I'm going through the armies in a little bit more detail this time around, because I feel as though in a 1v1 the composition is a little bit more pronounced, because obviously the numbers on the field are a little bit more limited. So when you have a look at the armies, the strengths and weaknesses will become immediately apparent. Over here we do have some Narim over on this side, slightly less focused around an elongated skirmish fight in their Variag mercenaries, and they might actually struggle a little bit actually against the sturdier Belagai archers. But in terms of outright damage and obviously the flaming arrows as well, which are purely cosmetic but they do look fairly intimidating, you'd be surprised what sort of panic they can actually engender in a foe. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how the Narim perform against the slightly more workman-like Belagai archers across the way. We also have some Flagrim. Obviously the main Rune are very much an all-rounder faction. They're a bit of a jack of all trades. They don't really have anything that they're terrible at. But the thing that they certainly focus on a little bit more than everything else is, of course, their armour piercing on their front line. And the Flagrim are pretty much typify that. They're the only real choice for Rune if you want to go for a high-quality army and you want a unit of line infantry. Like, you can use the Clansmen with both levels of armour upgrades, and they will do a job, but ultimately, as good as they are for what they cost, they're not going to be able to defeat higher tier units in the same way that Flagrim can if the matchup is favourable. Unfortunately for the Flagrim in this case, I feel as though they are at a bit of a disadvantage in compared to the Romana Abarim. The Nardukadar is a little bit more undecided, I think, because the Spear Malice is still a thing, even if the armour piercing does slightly offset that, so it'll be interesting to see if the Flagrim would be able to defeat them. What they do have at their disposal, however, I have noticed that Numenor do not have any Phalanx units, which means the Gamprim can really come into their own, of course. The Halberdier, very, very useful, will be very good at trying to equalise that frontline fight in favour of Rune against the really, really strong Romana units, offset a little bit of the lack of runic quality, perhaps, in this sort of situation. I mean, it's not a bad quality frontline, this Rune, but that is the thing you have to bear in mind with Rune. Like, they have got good quality throughout their army, but they do still lag behind some of the factions which really focus on their quality. They're rather like Isengard in that respect, I suppose. Like, Isengard have got some good quality, but they're not quite on the same level as someone like the Elves or the Dwarves, or in this case, Numenor. Some Scionrim are in there as well, very, very sturdy unit of spears. They don't have armour piercing, but they're really very, very tanky. I'm a big fan of the Scionrim, actually. Usually I'm not really a huge fan of spearmen that are just, they don't have anything special about them, and you could group the Scionrim into that category, but they always seem to be a super dependable unit for Rune, and in this sort of matchup, I feel as though that could be the case as well. Just a little bit of steel on the front line could go a long way. We have some more Narim back there. We have some Javelins, and the cheaper but higher damage armor-piercing skirmishes could be one of the keys for Rune in this battle, and the Baltrog tribesmen can count themselves among that. They're not as devastating as the Seafarers of Nindamos, but they do have a lot more ammunition at their disposal, and they are cheaper, so the Runic player probably won't mind quite so much if a few of them get caught out. The crossbows are another really good example of a Runic unit which is cheap, but potentially really, really devastating. If they can get into the right position and start raining bolts down onto the small Numenorian army, the damage they do quickly could be of a real concern to the Numenorian force across the way. Here we have the Clansmen with both levels of armor upgrades. Like I said, for what they cost, you know, they are probably the strongest militia swordsmen in the game when you give them both levels of their armor upgrades. Having said that, they are still a militia swordsman, and they are still going up against Numenorian infantry. The only unit they can probably stand a chance at defeating here would probably be the Balagaya footmen, and even that would probably be a close run thing. In this case, they're just here to bulk out the Runic infantry line and add a few numbers to the pile. This, though, is probably my main reason for suspecting that Rune may very well fancy their chances in this battle, because if it comes down to pure quality, even ranged at this point based on the look of the Runic army, I would give the advantage to Numenor, but this is a big deal. The Dragon's Breath, especially on a map like this, where there are sort of some artificial choke points put in place by the sort of the trenches that have been dug, the hills as well, giving the Dragon's Breath a little bit more elevation. It can be truly devastating. I would say that the Dragon's Breath, when the hotfix does eventually come out, it is going to be toned down a little bit, because at present it gives Rune such an advantage, especially on river crossing maps, and this map does bear a little bit in common with a river crossing. There are some choke points, so it'll be interesting to see how devastating this is, but it's a big weapon that Rune have at their disposal at the moment, and as it should be, but maybe not to the extent that it currently is. We'll see if Numenor can overcome that regardless. Some more Scion Rim, some more Flag Rim. Back over here, we do have the Sword and Board bodyguard of Rune, the Carmel's Chosen. Again, not quite on the level of the Royal Legion of Armenelos, and they have less men in the unit actually, but still, when it comes to facing off against the rest of the Numenorian line, sort of the standard Numenorian units, the Carmel's Chosen will at least be able to defeat them, which is nice for them. And also we have the Lance Knights, so the Carmel's Dragon Knights. They will want to steer clear of the Pharazon Nobles, because obviously Pharazon Nobles much more of a melee knight, but the Carmel's Dragon Knights, their charges are so devastating, and they are one of the tankiest units of knights in the game, all around, the Carmel's Dragon Knights, second only to the Knights of Numenor from Arthedain. They have a lot of armour, shield value very nice, they're just very, very difficult to kill. Even if they get caught on spears for a little while, they can often tank a little bit of damage before it really starts to bite in on them. But I think now, without further ado, after a bit of an extended look at these armies' compositions, let's begin. So, first thing is first, how are both teams going to set out? Now, interestingly enough, there may be a couple of hidden Runic units as well. That I can imagine there's probably Carmel's Shadow Bows around here. Other than that, though, there might not be much else in terms of, certainly in terms of Runic archers. When it comes to just an elongated skirmish fight, I'd give the advantage to Numenor here, because I think Rune have maybe underspent on their archers a little bit here, but I mean, this is going to be very key here, as the Runic catapult immediately rips right through the Numenorian line, and this honestly is on the Numenorian player. Like, as soon as he saw that Dragon's Breath cannon, he should have been scrambling to get his men split up into loose formation or behind cover. As it was, he just sort of sat there and allowed the Runic player to fire right through his army, and already Numenor have already got a relatively small army in comparison to the Easterlings that they're facing off against here. You don't want to be taking losses that early on, especially not to your Romani units as well, because that ripped right through the Nardukadar. I think it hit some of the Abarim as well, indeed it did, as well as hitting some of the Javelins, and it even clipped the Balagaya archers as well, so putting a small dent at the very least in Numenor's ranged superiority with regards to their archers at the very least. Here we go again. Again, Numenor have not done a very good job at moving their army quickly at all here. That wasn't as devastating, that certainly was though, and like, they're marching here, but they should be sprinting. Like, fatigue doesn't matter when you're under that amount of pressure from the Dragon's Breath this early. Again, Numenor can always fall back on their quality, but there is going to be a limit here. If they take too many losses to their Romani units here, which are going to be making up their front line, they're going to be in real trouble. And I'm very surprised here that Hunter Wayward is just continuing to sort of walk through and kind of blob his units up to make a pretty decent target for the Dragon's Breath. If I were Big Gun, I would be continuing to try and shoot into the Abarim here, because they're in a decent blob. Now, Hunter Wayward, better late than never, I suppose, is going to be getting his units into loose, but again, like I've said, the Dragon's Breath cannon, it's got such a wide area of effect for what it is and for how accurate it is, that loose formation doesn't really matter unless you spread the units out as well, which of course makes you a little bit more vulnerable to getting attacked by enemy units. But Rune are far enough away where I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue. It is going to be interesting to see. Good start from Rune. Definitely how they would have wanted this battle to start. It's not devastating damage like this. Don't get me wrong, like Numenor are certainly not sort of scrambling to stay in the battle by any means, but this is a lot of men to lose right from the off here. And it is certainly advantage Rune early on in this fight. And here we can see some hidden units, certainly. We've got the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, actually, which is an interesting choice. The Assassins throwing daggers, which are pretty devastating, to be honest with you, and they've got a very high melee defense as well. Assassin units are kind of an interesting thing to use. Like, they're certainly not as... They have a little... They're definitely a niche pick, shall we say. But he's also got some Shadow Guard, which, of course, in this situation, armor-piercing shock infantry is going to be useful, I think, against the heavily armoured Numenorians especially. Well, they will need to back up the Shadow Guard with some fodder in the form of some Clansmen, or maybe even some Flagrim, just to give them some numbers. But here you can see the Narim are getting into position and trying to do some more damage to the Numenorian front line. I'm very surprised, honestly, that the Belagair archers are not already shooting here. Like, one rule that you should always follow is never really allow your opponent to just freely shoot into your army, especially if you're the army which is focusing more on quality. Here you can see the Pharazim nobles just charging right on through those fire arrows, and the Narim are going to try and get away. Dragon's Breath is there. I mean, they're going to get there, I think. Yeah, they are. They need to be a little bit careful here, though, the Pharazim nobles. If they charge too deeply into the Narim, they will connect with the Gamp Rim, and that will be the last thing they want. But not really a very decisive charge, if I'm being honest, there from the Pharazim nobles. It got the Narim away, but it's much of a muchness, really. That's not really going to be too decisive in determining what happens between these two armies today. But Rune definitely setting out their stall very defensively. Both armies, I think, they want to be defensive, which on a map like this is understandable because you have choke points, which on a field battle like this is not something you often have at your disposal. 2 units of Narim, letting loose those flaming arrows. They're going to have to go back out into open ground once again, but honestly, like, Rune, there's no reason for them to move forward at this point. Rune, like, yes, they've taken the lead, and you could say the honourable thing to do would be to move forward and try and continue to put pressure onto Numenor. But from a runic perspective, what you want to do is you want to whittle, in this situation, you want to whittle Numenor down until you get to the point where your numbers will easily be able to overcome them. That's definitely the way that Rune are trying to approach this battle. And for Numenor, they need to try and stop Rune from doing that, because obviously it will get to a point eventually where Numenor just won't have the numbers to withstand Rune, even if their quality is higher. There you can see Eastron Clansmen. Looks like they're about to get charged here, and maybe a little bit of inexperience here being bred by the runic player, because the Eastron Clansmen are going to take a full frontal charge, and they are going to get absolutely flattened by the Pharazim nobles. And this is a situation, of course, where their slightly higher charge bonus than the other melee knights in the game is going to come in handy, absolutely bisecting the Eastron Clansmen there. Of all the runic units, this is the one that Big Gun probably minds losing the least, especially if he can try and take out a couple of Pharazim nobles with the Narim projectiles there. But certainly that could have all been avoided if the Scion Rim were just in behind the Clansmen, because they still would have taken the damage, but the cavalry wouldn't have charged in with a unit of heavily armoured spearmen just in behind. And there's also the crossbows there. Like, the crossbows, I'm surprised they weren't firing immediately, because the crossbows will be able to do damage against those knights, certainly. Here you can see the Narim as well, trading blows here with the Belagair archers, 95 to 73. And just based on positioning and based on the fact that I think the Belagair archers got the first volley in as well, the Narim are actually losing this fight, which you would kind of expect, to be honest with you. The Belagair archers, this is exactly the sort of situation that they are built for, whereas the Narim, a little bit less so. They don't have the shield value. They're a little bit more focused around damage, which is all well and good. They are struggling a little bit here. I think overall, in terms of stats, the Narim are actually slightly superior, but, you know, just this is exactly the sort of job that the Belagair archers are built to do, so you would back them in this situation against the runic offerings. Pharazim nobles are charging out against the Dragon Knights. The Dragon Knights and the Pharazim nobles have actually lost a couple of unit models already. The Dragon Knights are over here. What will Big Gun do here? I think he's going to charge into them. This is not a fight the Dragon Knights won. This is exactly the sort of thing the Pharazim nobles should win. But we definitely have a battle of the Titans here. I mean, this is the creme de la creme of both sides, although with the support of the Narim firing in there, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Pharazim nobles, I mean, the Dragon Knights didn't take any losses there, and the Pharazim nobles did, so the damage is starting to pile up for the Pharazim nobles, And of course, let's not forget that the charge on the Dragon Knights is stronger, so initially you'd actually expect them to do more damage, but in a prolonged fight, you would definitely back the Pharazôn Nobles. But once again, the Runic player actually doing the right thing there, charging in and then quickly filtering back out, putting pressure on the Pharazôn Nobles with ranged units. And so far so good, I would have to say, for the Runic player. I think Numenor is a little bit confounded here. I'm not sure he knows what he wants to do. He definitely wanted to be a little bit more defensive, I think, but those early losses have put him under pressure right from the start here. Belegaer archers firing in. Again, I don't imagine that it's going to be the easiest task here to kill off Carmel's Dragon Knights, but if they overextend too much, they could. Carmel's Dragon Knights are not the fastest knights on the field by any means. When you compare them to something like the Horse Lords of Ulmo from Linden, who are extremely quick, but not necessarily very heavily armoured or shielded at all, Carmel's Dragon Knight's pretty much the polar opposite, even if they do mostly the same thing. That's a risky charge to take. They charge in there, they will do damage to the Remen and Nar-Dukadar, but this is not where the Dragon Knights want to be at all, and you can see there that, yeah, they're going to live to regret that. A few too many unit models lost there. Only 3 or 4 Remen and Nar-Dukadar actually fell in that charge because of the defensive abilities of spearmen, and then the armour-piercing spears started poking and prodding and reflecting the charge back onto the Carmel's Dragon Knights. This is... well, again, it's very aggressive use of the cavalry here. This will be a little bit better. The Remen at Abarim are not built to take charges like that, so they will do damage. But the Dragon Knights here, they are right in and amongst it. They are going to charge into the Seafarers of Nindamos, but the Javelins are coming in, and several of them do connect. And I can't imagine here that the Carmel's Dragon Knights are going to last too much longer without breaking here. They may be knights, but yeah, broken and fighting to the death. Like, that sort of aggressive cavalry play works if you have more than one cavalry unit that can put pressure on multiple angles. If it's just the one cavalry unit, even if it's as tough as the Carmel's Dragon Knights, it's far too easy to focus it down, especially when you've got, you know, armour-piercing spears, melee knights, javelins, especially of the quality of the Seafarers of Nindamos. Meanwhile, incoming here, not an altogether decisive blow that from the Dragon's Breath. More damage done to the Belegaer archers, but I think the real prize are the Remena units in front, who have taken more damage at the hands of those Carmel's Dragon Knights. But a bit of good news for Numenor in this fight, because so far the pressure had been building on them, but I think it may very well be turning a corner here. Yeah, and the Dragon Knights here, the Numenor player doing the right thing, although I would say that he's wasting javelin volleys, precious javelin volleys actually, on routing units. It would have been sufficient to just have the Pharazôn Nobles finish them off. The Seafarers of Nindamos do not have the ammunition to be frivolous with. Meanwhile, still these Belegaer archers up on this higher position. What have we got going on here? Again, I don't think it was by design that he hit those Seafarers of Nindamos. I think the Runic player is actually trying to target the Belegaer archers with the Dragon's Breath, which is not the right thing to be doing. Again, Numenor, if there is a sacrificial element to their army, it's their Belegaer units, the archers and the footmen. Everything else is what Numenor will be trying to defend. But now, of course, Rune don't have any cavalry, which means the mobility is entirely in Numenor's favour, and now the archers have gotten too far away from their infantry support. So now the Pharazôn Nobles are going to be able to get a charge off without too many issues, and they're going to charge into the Narim. That's a lot of arrows they're taking there, but shields and armour strong on the Pharazôn Nobles, only losing one more unit model. They're going to be able to get in here, and this is a problem for Rune, because this is going to take away their entire ability to even contest the long-range game at this point, which is going to surrender most of the ranged advantage to Numenor. Rune will be entirely dependent on their Dragon's Breath at long range, or they have to hope that Numenor use up all their ammunition soon, which will allow them to then claim the ranged advantage with their strong crossbowmen. More arrows finding their mark, but big damage done. And the Pharazôn Nobles, to be fair, I think this is the best use for the Pharazôn Nobles at this point in the battle. I mean, it is the General's bodyguard, so if they lose the General, that won't be ideal. Whereas the Runic General is in the Carmel's Chosen on foot, and I can't imagine we'll see them committed until much later on. Bit of friendly fire going on here as well from the Belegaer archers, but just having a look over here, like, if you imagine the Pharazôn Nobles trying to get in and amongst the main body of the Runic army, there's a lot of halberdiers, there's the Scion Rim, there's javelins and crossbows nearby to try and zone them out with ranged attacks as well, so going after the Nar Rim might be the best thing for them. But so far, neither side has truly committed yet. And you would say that there are more bodies on the Numenorian side of things still. Some of them are the Carmel's Dragon Knights, admittedly, but overall, in terms of actual units felled, Rune are probably still ahead. But looking at the bigger picture in the battle, I feel as though Rune will probably be a little bit concerned about how this battle has turned. But I do understand why Rune are not the ones moving forward either, because I would not want to move forward into those Remena Bawabarim either. Because you need, if you're going to move forward as Rune in this situation, you need to do it with your entire army. Because otherwise the Numenorian quality is just going to swallow you whole. So you're going to need to move forward with stuff like your Carmel's Chosen, your Carmel's Shadow Guard, your Scion Rim. You need all of those units to come forward with the main body of your army. And if you do that, the Bawabarim are just going to tee off into all of your most important units. And then that's bad news bears for you. Because there's no way that the just standard runic units are going to be able to withstand the Numenorian quality, even as depleted as it is from the Dragon's Breath. Carmel's Shadow Bows, moving forwards, they do have the ranges, interestingly enough. On a battlefield as open as this, I'll be interested to see how Rune can utilise those ranges. But for me, I don't think Numenor will be too concerned about that. The Dragon's Breath is also still a factor, but here a bit of a lull here. Once again, I'm convinced that neither one of these players wants to be the one to make the initial move, but because again, both sides with their skirmishers, with the way that the battle is laid out with these sort of artificial trenches filled with water, both sides have got such potent units at range that whoever moves forward first feels as though they're just going to be ripped to shreds. And I can understand rangers, crossbows and javelins for Rune, armor-piercing archers for Numenor. So both sides just trying to maneuver. And again, like, Big Gun has been a little bit guilty of this. He's left some units just a little bit too much out in the open. And once again, the Scion Rim just a little bit too far away, and the Pharazim Nobles able to charge in here and do some damage to the Carmel Shadow Bows. The Belagaia archers are now in position to also fire away. The Pharazim Nobles are very depleted at this point, and the Scion Rim are over here, but even so, like, the Pharazim Nobles, in terms of kills and value generated like that, I'm not sure the Pharazim Nobles have actually paid for themselves yet. They must be on the cusp of doing so, but that's not important. What they have done is made life just that little bit more difficult for Rune. And actually, it looks as though now Rune are going to be moving forward, but they're going to be moving forward over here. They're going to be trying to avoid the Remena Bawabarim, which is exactly the right thing to do. If Rune are going to be aggressive, then first and foremost they need to be more aggressive over here, because this is where Numenor are at their most depleted, and it's furthest away from the most deadly Numenorian ranged units. And if they do it quickly as well, if they continue to move forward quickly, they should be able to get into melee before the Seafarers of Nindamos can utilise their javelins. But I feel as though that's kind of an inevitability about this fight. Like, the Seafarers are going to get at least one decent volley off here. And that won't be ideal, but Rune are going to be the ones to move forward, so this battle is going to be decided now fairly quickly, I think. We'll get the lay of the land fairly soon. The Carmel Shadow Guard are moving in. They have a numbers advantage over the Remena Abarim, but this is a very professional unit of soldiers here. And like I said, when it comes to using a unit of armor-piercing shock infantry like this, I always like to support them because they tend to have lower melee defense to sort of offset the fact that they have a very high attack, armor-piercing attack. In come the Dragon's Breath, and like the Dragon's Breath ripping through those Seafarers, probably the best target for them, to be honest with you. But Rune, their attack is a little bit too stretched out for me. Like, they needed to move forward in a little bit more of a unified fashion than this. Like, the Scion Rim are doing the business so far against the Nardukadar, but that's more because Hunter Wayward hasn't committed the Abarim forwards. As soon as he does, stuff like the Clansmen are going to be easy pickings. Carmel's Shadow Guard defeat is almost a certainty again. You know, after that initial charge came forward, like, the charge did damage, but now the higher melee defense and stats overall of the Remena Abarim is coming good against the Carmel's Shadow Guard. The Bawabarim are actually coming off their hill now. I imagine they're going to sort of decamp to this hill. But yeah, like, Rune, they need this cannon to start doing some heavy lifting for them. It's continuing to get kills, to be fair, but not as decisively perhaps as Rune would want. And now the Scion Rim are taking damage from the Seafarers of Nindamos as well. Not a lot of ammunition, but what ammunition they do have has been decisive. Credit to the runic player for moving forward, but well, there goes the Numenorian General, Baltroth Tribesman. The Numenorian General was back here, and they did do some pretty serious damage to the Eastron Crossbowmen. The Shadow Bows and the Javelins are here. All of the runic skirmishers that need to be closer to the front, they need to get forward and support the runic advance. And yeah, this is the problem for me now. The Belagaia footmen are moving around. Like, not the most devastating unit to come and flank you, but the fact that they are getting surrounded at this point, Rune, is a problem. They still have units all the way back there as well. Like, it just, for me, that shows a bit of naivety on the part of the runic player. Like, if he didn't feel as though he needed the entirety of his army to destroy an army that is as quality heavy as Numenor, then to me that shows that, you know, a little bit of inexperience, a little bit of naivete, as I said. But the Boabrim now, they're in a perfect position, teeing off into the runic approach. The armor-piercing arrows going to be finding their marks, which is terrible news for Rune, to be honest with you. Like, this was a fairly decent chunk of runic soldiers that was coming forward. Scion Rim, Flag Rim, and Gamprim, the triumvirate of runic line infantry. But all the Abarim and the Nardukadai need to do is hold them in place. Seafarers of Nindamos joining the fight means that should be fairly easy to do. Yeah, and Rune's approach was just far too broken up. And let's not forget as well that the elite Numenorian infantry also has yet to commit itself forward. Are they trying to hit the Belagai footmen? That's risky as well, because if a slightly misplaced shot and it rips through your own infantry. Over here, this was probably the best chance that Rune had of trying to turn this fight in their favour, utilising their crossbows and their rangers, but the Numenor player, very savvy here in engaging them in melee, getting his seafarers out of ammunition now, being able to be used as a more utilitarian infantry unit. And they're going to be moving forward. And without these crossbows and these rangers supporting the runic infantry, I think they're going to fall apart very, very quickly. You can see that over here, moving along this side of the canal, there are the Carmel's Chosen moving forward. The Baltroth Tribesmen are being engaged in melee by the Belagai archers, but even the Carmel's Chosen at this point I don't think are going to be able to save this. Yeah, once again, like you can see there, not a particularly good idea. I mean, the Belagai footmen have routed, but any amount of friendly fire is too much friendly fire for Rune at this point. You can see here as well. The Baltroth Tribesmen move forward, but coming across this way, the Baltroth Tribesmen really should have moved around this side where there was less of a ranged threat from Numenor, because they moved forward and they were instantly targeted down by the Boabrim. They don't have a lot of ammunition, but like it is going to... Rune... It will take some killing here from a Numenorian perspective because they had the numbers advantage, but Numenor have used their ranged units. Even with their depleted infantry units, they did very well with what they had. Forward come the Romena Boabrim, now being used as makeshift infantry units surrounding this runic front line. To be fair, Numenor have had to peel off more units over here to try and stop an advance. Oof. That was actually a pretty good shot there, right into the Romena Boabrim, and actually breaking them. Maybe not all is lost. I mean, the problem I think here for Rune is there's still a unit of Boabrim over here, but there's still the Royal Legion, there's still the Pharazim Swordmasters. When all is said and done, Rune are fighting tooth and nail at the moment against the main body of the Numenorian army. But even if they manage to sort of haul themselves over the line, are they going to have what it takes to defeat those two Numenorian elites? I think not. Seafarer is going to be finishing off the crossbows. The crossbows haven't really achieved anything, which is always a pretty good barometer of how well an army is doing. Like if certain key skirmishes are not really achieving much of anything, that's usually a bad sign. The Carmel's Shadowbows have gotten a few volleys off, but again, nothing too decisive. They're going to win at least. They're going to be able to get free and start firing in. And also the Carmel's Chosen are over here, and the Carmel's Chosen, in conjunction with what's left of the Baltroth Tribesmen, are going to be able to defeat the depleted spears and the Belagai archers. So that's something for Rune to hold on to. We shall see if it proves to be decisive. But over here I think Rune should win. These Flag Rim need to get re-engaged. The Baltroth Sapphire Bladesmen are here, but the Flag Rim, what they need to do is move around here, surround the Seafarers and quickly finish this area off, because again, it's these elites that I'm really worried about from a runic perspective. I feel like I've been more critical of the runic player this whole time, but I will say as well, Numenor did have Rune right there where he wanted them, and has kind of spread himself too thin. For me, I probably would have committed at least one of these elite infantry units sooner, and that probably would have made Numenor's life a lot more comfortable. Even if it was, Royal Legion or Pharazim Swordmasters, doesn't really matter. I feel as though if one of them had been committed earlier when Numenor were in the ascendancy, this battle would probably already be on the verge of being over, to be honest with you. As it is, Rune still have a little bit of hope in this fight, if they can get their rangers free, and if they can win this fight over here in a convincing fashion. And also, this is a unit I actually did forget about, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. The Assassins. Being forgotten is exactly what they want, because they've got their throwing knives as well, and they're not the easiest unit to kill off in melee either, if I'm being honest with you. So Numenor is in a little bit of danger here. They definitely need to be a little bit careful here, in my mind. Carmel's Chosen victory seems certain once again. They are taking losses, to be fair. Like, the armor piercing of the Nardukadai is causing casualties for the Carmel's Chosen, but they're still going to win this fairly comfortably. Belagai archers moving backwards. Like, the Carmel's Shadowbows, if they still have ammunition, they need to get over here and start shooting along some Numenorian lines, because over here, this would be perfect for the Rangers to shoot into, because, yes, you won't kill off the Royal Legion or the Pharazim Swordmasters all that quickly, but You need something to do damage to them, because if you try and take them on in melee from now until the end of the battle, Numenor will win that, and they will be fairly comfortable doing so. The Scion Rim and the Flag Rim on the front line here are going to be doing their best, but over the long haul here, the Numenorians will have the advantage. There's still the damage coming in from the Nar Rim. The Pharazim's Swordmasters coming across, Seafarers of Nindamos routing off. The Carmel's Shadowbows are very depleted. In come the Throwing Knives. It's going to be the Throwing Knives and the ammunition from these Rangers. Rune need them to do a lot of work for them. Could be that they've already run out of Throwing Knives. No, they haven't. They need the Throwing Knives to do some work on the Pharazim Swordmasters. Their armor piercing, decent amount of damage. Here they go. Again, the multiple HP nature of the Pharazim Swordmasters doing the business. Belagire archers that are off to the side, stopping the shadow bows from firing. Yeah, I think Numenor are going to be fine in this fight, to be honest with you. I just don't think Rune have got the legs left in their army to contest it for too much longer. Like this fight over here, Royal Legion actually losing. I feel as though that is because of the ranged support that the Nar Rim are offering to the runic infantry, but it's still not, even if they do end up somehow winning that fight, which I somehow doubt, it's not going to be good for them. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen were chased off, which gave the Pharazim Swordmaster a chance to come in here and surround the Carmel's Chosen. And now, also with some additional support from the Bawabarim from the front, that should be enough to finish off the Runic General's bodyguard. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are going to come back now and try and get some daggers in the back of the Pharazim Swordmasters, which is absolutely going to be required if they are to have any hope here in this fight, Rune. But I think even that's being quite generous. I think Numenor at this point will be feeling fairly comfortable about their chances. Another volley. Again, standing very firm, the Pharazim Swordmasters. Now charging into melee, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. It's a brave effort, this, from the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, but they will, of course, lose this fight. Their melee defense may be very high, but overall, in terms of the ability to just kill enemy units, the Pharazim Swordmasters are by far and away the superior of the two. Also got some Seafarers of Nindamos over here, alongside what was left of the Belagire archers, going to be finishing off the Shadow Bows. Menon Ardukadar, the Carmel's Chosen, still fighting hard on the front line. Here you can see as well the Dragon's Breath crew coming forward to try and offer a little bit more support into this grindfest over in this choke point over here. Getting a little bit of friendly fire there from the Nar Rim, but to be fair, that Nar Rim support has been fairly decisive actually over here, because they have been focusing down the Royal Legion of Armenlos. Not grievous wounds by any means, but kills have been achieved. But ultimately, it was just, I feel as though it was Rune's organisation. Their attack was just too stretched, and ultimately that allowed Numenor to be more comfortable, which is one of the reasons why I think both sides were more reluctant to move forwards as well. Because of course the presence of both sides' scary ranged units meant that if you move forward as one big group, you're always going to have your best units focused down to some extent or another. But if you went with the approach that Rune did here of sort of trying to stagger your attack so that the skirmishes maybe weren't quite so devastating, all that meant was the very first engagements of Rune went very poorly, and Rune just have never really recovered from that, to be honest with you. Belagire archers are heading back to the front now as well. Not many of them, but they're just going to be finishing off the Rangers in the background there. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen very quickly being dealt with by the Pharazim Swordmasters, to be fair. Not a unit that's going down quickly though, the Carmel's Chosen. They've stayed in melee for an awfully long time, as you would expect from a unit like them. Like, they don't necessarily have the best killing power to them, but they are a very tough unit, to be fair. And then over here, Royal Legion of Armenlos. The runic units on the front line now very tired. The golden armour looks nice, but it's not going to be enough to give the Easterlings victory here. Dragon's Breath crew won't be enough either. There's the Nar Rim. I feel as though the runic player is probably going to admit defeat here. Carmel's Chosen. There goes the general. That'll probably be the catalyst for the end of the battle, to be honest with you. Carmel's Chosen defeated. This flank wrapped up from Numenor, so this now really is the only fight that remains. And with only 200 frames, I can assume he's going to admit defeat, because I don't think Numenor are going to be able to waddle over there to finish off those Nar Rim up close and personal like. There goes the routing from them. The runic front line routes off. And there we go. Close though. A close battle, especially for a 1v1 this. You know, 1v1s can very often turn into a landslide one way or the other. especially considering the situation Rune put themselves into here. It's exactly the sort of thing where you'd expect a sort of runaway victory from Numenor. But in the end, I feel as though Numenor maybe, they were a little bit reluctant to use their elite units, which is probably why Rune weren't finished off it to the extent that they could have been. But I would also say that Rune didn't necessarily play this in the wrong way. I feel as though execution was the issue here more so than the tactic, because Rune could have won doing exactly what they did. Like, I feel as though if they'd managed to get their crossbows into a good position to fire, if they got their rangers into get even just a few more volleys, like crossbows, rangers, javelins, these are exactly the sort of units where if you just get a few volleys off, the damage can be fairly significant. And that could have been the difference, because if Numenor were still then reluctant to use their Royal Legion and their Pharazim Swordmasters, the Numenor line could have collapsed in that case. So fine margins, but in the end, I do think Numenor did deserve the win, because ultimately they were able to stay patient, and ultimately they did bait Rune into coming forwards first, which neither side was really too keen on doing because of the defensive positions both sides had. I will say, I can understand why Numenor did that. If Numenor had been the one to move forward, just 1 or 2 blasts from the Dragon's Breath, as well as a few volleys, which would have been far easier for the crossbows to achieve from the crossbows, it would have been devastating for Numenor, especially with their smaller army. Like their unit model, their relative size, their manpower, it just wouldn't have been sustainable for Numenor to do that, especially considering the early losses they took. So that kind of did dictate how Numenor could have approached the battle. And Hunter Wayward, to be fair, executed pretty well. Like I would say that the only thing I would have done differently was I probably would have tried to turn the screw on Rune sooner by committing at least one of my units of elite infantry into melee. Probably the Royal Legion of Armenelos, because they're a little bit more tanky. They would have been a little bit more at home under the fire from the Narim, as they proved. Only about 10 of them died under pretty sustained pressure from them. But yeah, very well played by both players, I will say. Let's have a look and see what did the damage for Numenor. So we have several units breaking 100 kills, which is not too surprising considering Numenor were the more quality-focused army here, including the Pharazim nobles. So they did buzz around. They were ultimately killed off, of course, but they did blunt the runic skirmish line quite significantly, which did turn out to be very important. Pharazim Swordmasters were only committed later on. The Royal Legion were in melee for longer against a single target, which is why they got more kills, 126, not a bad performance at all. Obviously, both armor-piercing archers getting around 100 kills is fairly standard, considering their ammunition is very low, but it was very important as well, because they really did a lot of damage to the runic blob, which Rune's numbers could have been enough to win that fight for them if the Boabrim had not been there. But of course, that was very deliberate from Hunter Wayward. He knew what he was doing by putting them there. The Abarim, mixed fortunes. I think the one that got the fewest kills was probably the one that was very depleted from the Dragon's Breath. The other two did very well against the runic infantry. The Balagar archers did okay in their skirmish fight. The Seafarers, again, somewhat mixed. One of them getting fewer kills, the other two getting good kills. Again, a mix of their javelins and being decent in melee. The Balagar footmen did very poorly, to be fair. They came around and tried to surround the runic player, but the Dragon's Breath, very risky play to try and shoot them, but it was made and it paid off in the end, because it routed the Balagar footmen almost immediately. And in the end, a very poor performance from them. But the rest of the Numenorian army did what you would expect them to do in this sort of situation, to be fair. Yeah, a very good fight, I would say, to be honest with you. On a map which is quite interesting. Like, again, I like my field battles with a little bit more interest to them. Like, I cannot stand when the battles are just like a flat field, because there's nothing interesting about that to me. Like, at this point, with how long I've been doing sort of Medieval 2 based content, I've seen every possible way in which a 1v1 battle on a flat field is going to work out, and it just does not interest me at all. But on a map like this, that I haven't seen before, where there's sort of terrain features, there's different ways in which it can work out, it is much more interesting to me, because I feel as though in this sort of situation it does lead to some more interesting compositions for me, and yeah. And in this sort of situation, I feel as though both sides wanted to be more defensive, use the terrain, let the terrain do a little bit more of the work for them. And just looking at the compositions and how people wanted to set the table out for themselves, it was always going to come down to who was brought out of their comfort zone first. And in the end, that was Rune. And that was largely down to Hunter Wayward managing to do serious damage to his skirmish line. And also the fact that the runic player, I feel as though he didn't really bring the right tools to go into an elongated skirmish fight with Numenor, which he really should have done if he was intending to be more defensive. I would have gone for upgraded Veriag mercenaries personally as my skirmish archer, and I probably would have I don't know really, I still would have gone for crossbows. I think still would have gone for rangers. Yeah, again, it's all ifs, ands, buts and maybes, to be honest with you. The fact of the matter is, Rune came forward first when they didn't really want to, you could tell, and in the end, Numenor was able to exploit that very nicely, I would say, with their really elite infantry to hold back a force of superior numbers, and then using their very nasty skirmishers to do the damage that was necessary to give them the win. So big thank you to Hunter Wayward for sending this battle in. Big thank you to both players involved in this battle for making it a good one. It was competitive, and Rune could have pulled it back towards the end, but in the end they just weren't able to. The manpower just wasn't on their side. So yeah, next up we will be returning to a larger scale siege, I think, because I'll have a little bit more time to record after all my deadlines are passed, which will be good, of course. But it's always good to get a little bit of variety in, and I feel as though just the fact that this is a map that I haven't seen before is enough to definitely justify its place in the screening order, as it were. But yeah, I'm not sure what battle I will do next. I do have some Toll for Lass. I have a battle on Hornburg, even if Helm's Deep still is not really working properly, because obviously it needs to be fixed in the hotfix. Really, the hotfix can't come soon enough. And I think I have a couple more. I mean, yeah, I think I have... what's that map called? Terribly unprofessional of me to just start musing at the end of this particular video. But regardless, I'll decide on a sort of larger scale siege to do as my next battle. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.